My name is Maya Bennett. 3 years ago, I married into one of the most respected families in Harbour Point. They were rich, polished, admired, and powerful. At least, that's what everyone believed. I believed it too. Until the day I went to visit my husband's father at a rehab center and overheard a conversation that changed my life forever. What I heard in that hallway didn't just break my marriage, it exposed an entire family. The Ashfords were the kind of family people talked about with a mix of envy and admiration. Their name was everywhere, on scholarship plaques, on charity programs, on buildings downtown. People described them as elegant, generous, and untouchable. And after I married Julian Ashford, I became part of that world, or at least I thought I did. Julian was calm, intelligent, and careful with his words. He made me feel chosen, safe, like I had stepped into a future that was bigger and more secure than anything I had imagined for myself. Then his father, Victor, suffered a mild stroke and was moved into Crestview Rehabilitation Center. A few days later, Julian asked me to stop by and visit him. He said Victor was improving. He said the family had been under a lot of stress, and he asked if I could bring the lemon tea his father liked. It sounded simple, kind even. So I brought the tea and soup, and guilt because I had waited 3 days to visit. I told myself I was doing the right thing. I had no idea I was walking straight into the moment that would split my life into before and after. When I got to the rehab center, everything felt ordinary. The smell of disinfectant, the quiet hum of the lights, the soft shuffle of nurses moving through the hallway. I was balancing the soup on one arm and the paper bag with the tea in my hand when I reached Victor's room. And before I stepped inside, I heard a voice. It was my mother-in-law, Eleanor. Her voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice she used when she wanted to sound calm while saying something cruel. Then I heard my own name, and I stopped. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the moment I heard what she said next, I couldn't move. She said I couldn't be kept close to the records anymore. She said if an audit expanded, I could become a liability, and if I started asking questions, I could become dangerous. I remember just standing there, frozen, because for a second my brain refused to process what I was hearing. Then Julian answered, and what he said hurt even more. He said I didn't know enough to be dangerous. Not enough to be dangerous. That was how my husband described me. Not as his wife, not as someone he loved, not as family. Just someone useful, someone manageable, someone they assumed would never see the truth. Then Eleanor laughed softly and made it worse. She said I had been useful because I had a clean reputation and access to the right paperwork, but useful, she made clear, was not the same thing as permanent. That was the moment the paper cup slipped out of my hand. The tea hit the floor, the lid burst open, and all three of them turned toward the door. I'll never forget the look on Julian's face. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't shame, it was irritation, like I had arrived too early and interrupted a business meeting. Eleanor stood up first, perfect posture, perfect coat, perfect expression, and she looked at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. I asked them what they meant by putting agreements under my name. Julian tried to calm me down. He told me I had heard only part of the conversation. He said it was administrative. He said I was upset. He said we shouldn't do this there. But I asked him again, directly, and when he hesitated, I knew. That pause told me everything. So I left, and he followed me into the hallway, still trying to minimize it, still trying to make me feel irrational. But by then, something in me had already changed, because in that moment, for the first time, I believed none of them, not one word. I went home and opened every file I could access: emails, approvals, invoices, tax documents. At first, it all looked like boring administrative clutter, but the more I looked, the more patterns began to emerge. The same vendors appeared across unrelated projects. Consulting payments were attached to programs that didn't exist. Approvals with my digital signature appeared on days I hadn't even been in the office. Then, sometime after 1 in the morning, I found the document that made everything clear. It was an authorization form connected to a project I had never heard of, and it carried my signature, or at least something close enough to pass as mine. That was when I understood what they had been doing. The Ashfords had been moving money through their non-profit network, and if anyone started tracing the paperwork, the mess would lead straight to me. I wasn't the wife they were protecting. I was the person they were preparing to sacrifice. I called the one person in my life I knew would tell me the truth, my college friend Tessa Wynne. Tessa was now an investigative reporter. When I told her I thought my husband's family was setting me up for fraud, she didn't overreact. She didn't tell me I was paranoid. She simply told me to copy everything, leave the house if I could, and wait for her. When she arrived, we spent hours backing up files and cross-checking records, and by the end of the day, we found something even bigger. The Ashfords were not protecting a stable empire. They were hiding a collapse. Behind the beautiful charity events and polished public image, the family was drowning in debt. A luxury project had failed. A waterfront expansion was stuck in litigation. Loans had been taken against assets that were already over-leveraged. The foundation wasn't just a charity arm. It had become a financial shield, a place to move money quietly while the rest of the structure started falling apart. And Julian knew all of it. That was the part that hurt most. Not just that he lied, but that he knew exactly how much I trusted him, and used that trust anyway. That night, I packed a suitcase and left, not because I had a perfect plan, but because staying would have meant pretending I still didn't understand what was happening. Tessa connected me with a defense attorney named Rowan Pierce, and Rowan said something I never forgot. He told me to stop acting like a spouse and start acting like a witness. That one sentence changed everything. So I did. I saved messages, archived voicemails, documented every attempt Julian made to soften the situation, every apology, every half-threat, every message that tried to frame this as a misunderstanding instead of a setup. And the more they reached out, the more obvious it became. They weren't trying to repair the marriage, they were trying to control the fallout. A few days later, Eleanor invited me to the family home. She said they wanted to resolve things with dignity. That phrase alone told me exactly what the meeting was really about: damage control. I went anyway. The dining room looked exactly the way it always had: expensive, immaculate, cold. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. Julian sat beside her. Victor was still in rehab, but the family attorney was there in his place. They offered me a generous settlement, a quiet separation, a clean exit. All I had to do was agree not to interfere with the restructuring of the foundation, and when I asked what would happen if I refused, their attorney answered for them. He warned me that serious discrepancies were tied to my administrative access. There it was. No more pretending, no more soft language, just the threat. If I didn't cooperate, they were prepared to let the blame fall on me. Even Eleanor called it mercy. Mercy, that word told me everything. They still expected me to feel grateful for being discarded gently. So I told them the truth. I told them the Financial Crimes Unit already had the documents, the altered authorizations, the vendor trails, the transfers, and my statement explaining exactly when I realized I was being positioned to absorb the liability. For the first time since I had known them, the Ashfords had no response. Julian went pale, and Eleanor's composure cracked, just for a second, but it was enough, because fear had finally replaced control. The months that followed were ugly: audits, investigations, resignations, public scrutiny. The foundation was suspended, the shell vendors were exposed, the money trails led exactly where they should have, and the family that had spent years building a flawless public image suddenly had to answer for what had been hiding underneath it. Julian moved out before the separation was even finalized. Later, he sent me one final message. He said I had chosen outsiders over family, but by then I understood something I wish I had learned much earlier. People who use loyalty as a weapon always call accountability betrayal. I rebuilt my life slowly. I went back to my work. I moved into a smaller apartment. I slept better there than I ever had in the Ashford house, and over time I stopped mourning the life I thought I had, because the truth is, it was never real. What was real was that hallway, that half-open door, that paper cup slipping from my hand, that single moment when I finally heard what they really thought of me. If I had arrived 2 minutes later, maybe I would have stayed blind longer, maybe I would have signed more documents, maybe I would have gone down with them, but I didn't. I heard the truth in time, and when the family that built everything on appearances finally started to fall apart, they learned something they should have known from the beginning. I was never the weakest person in the room. I was just the last one to see what the room really was. For a while, I thought it was over. The investigations had started, the Ashfords were under scrutiny, and I had done what I needed to do to protect myself. But what I didn't understand yet was that families like theirs don't collapse all at once. They resist, quietly, strategically. About 2 weeks after I moved out, I started noticing small things. Emails that bounced back, accounts that required additional verification, a credit alert I hadn't triggered. At first, I thought it was just fallout, systems reacting to the investigation, but then my bank flagged a transfer request I never made. It wasn't completed, but it existed, and it had my credentials attached to it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't over. Someone was still trying to use my identity. I called Rowan immediately. He didn't sound surprised. He said this was the part most people don't anticipate. When exposure fails to contain the damage, people start trying to rewrite the narrative. And if they couldn't quietly assign blame to me before, they might try to create new evidence that would make it look like I was still involved. That night, I changed everything. Passwords, devices, access points. Rowan arranged for a forensic review of my accounts, and within 48 hours, we found traces of attempted access routed through a proxy server tied to one of the shell vendors we had already flagged. It wasn't random, it was connected. And, more importantly, it meant someone inside their network was still actively trying to build a case against me. Tessa took interest immediately. Not just as my friend, but as a journalist, because this wasn't just financial misconduct anymore. This was obstruction, possibly even fraud layered on top of fraud, and she saw the story expanding. She asked me one question that changed the direction of everything. She asked if I was willing to go public, not anonymously, not behind documents, but as a direct voice. At first, I said no, because going public meant stepping out of protection and into visibility. It meant my name would no longer be something I could quietly rebuild around. It would be attached to everything: the investigation, the accusations, the Ashfords. But the more I thought about it, the clearer something became. They were still betting on silence, still assuming I would stay careful, stay quiet, stay manageable. And for the second time, I realized they didn't understand who I was becoming. The interview was scheduled 3 days later. Tessa didn't rush it. She prepared me. Not just for the questions, but for the consequences. She told me exactly how these things unfold. First, the story breaks. Then comes the denial. Then the quiet attempts to discredit. And if that fails, escalation. The night before the interview, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of what I would say, but because I understood what it would trigger. Once it was out, there would be no returning to anything resembling normal. The Ashfords wouldn't just see me as a liability anymore, they would see me as a direct threat. The interview itself was simple. No dramatic lighting, no scripted lines, just a camera, a chair, and the truth. I told the story from the beginning. The marriage, the trust, the hallway, the documents, the realization. I didn't exaggerate anything. I didn't need to. The facts were enough. When Tessa asked me why I decided to speak publicly, I answered honestly. I said because silence was the only thing that had ever made their system work, and I wasn't going to be part of that system anymore. The story was published the next morning. Within hours, it spread, not just locally, but nationally. The Ashford name carried weight, and anything tied to it moved quickly. By midday, their foundation released a statement, carefully worded, predictable. They described the allegations as misunderstandings, they emphasized their commitment to transparency, and they subtly questioned my credibility without directly attacking me. It was exactly the response Tessa had predicted. But what they didn't anticipate was the reaction that followed. Former employees began reaching out, quietly at first, then more openly. People who had seen inconsistencies, people who had been told not to ask questions, people who had left without understanding why things felt wrong. The pattern was growing, and once patterns become visible, they become difficult to control. That was when the pressure shifted. It was no longer just about me defending myself, it was about them defending everything, and the more they tried to contain it, the more attention it drew. A week after the story broke, I received a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was short, direct. It asked if we could meet. No names, no explanation, just a time and a location. I sent it to Rowan before responding. He traced the number within a few hours. It belonged to someone who had once worked inside the Ashford financial structure, a mid-level analyst who had left 2 years earlier. Quiet exit. No public issues, which made it more interesting. Rowan advised caution, but he didn't tell me not to go. Instead, he arranged to be nearby. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, the kind of place where conversations disappear into background noise. When I arrived, he was already there. He introduced himself simply as Daniel. He didn't waste time with small talk. He said he had read the article. He said he believed me. And then he said something that immediately changed the stakes. He said what I had uncovered was only a fraction of what had actually been happening. According to him, the nonprofit structure wasn't just being used to move money. It was being used to delay the collapse of multiple failing investments by masking losses as operational expenses. And it had been happening for years. He had tried to raise concerns internally, not formally, just enough to test reactions, and the response had been immediate. He was reassigned, then quietly pushed out. What he had brought with him wasn't just information, it was documentation, internal reports, financial projections, communications that never been part of the official records, the kind of material that didn't just suggest misconduct, it demonstrated intent. When I asked him why he hadn't come forward earlier, his answer was simple. He said no one had forced the story into the open yet. Until now, everything had been deniable, contained, manageable. But that had changed, and he decided it was safer to be part of the truth than remain connected to what was coming next, because in his words, collapse doesn't happen slowly when it finally starts. it accelerates. And he believed the Ashfords were closer to that point than anyone realized. When we reviewed the documents Daniel provided, even Rowan paused, not because he didn't understand them, but because of what they implied. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was structured deception, layered, deliberate, and sustained over time. The kind of operation that depends on everyone playing their role without asking too many questions. And for the first time, I saw exactly where I had fit into it. Not at the center, not even close. I had been positioned at the edge, close enough to sign, far enough to absorb impact. It was precise, calculated, and disturbingly effective. Tessa began working on a second story immediately, but this time, it wasn't just about my experience, it was about the system itself, the structure, the design, the way influence, reputation, and complexity had been used to hide something that should have been visible. Before publication, Rowan coordinated with the Financial Crimes Unit to ensure the new material was formally submitted, which meant that when the story went live, it wasn't just public pressure anymore. It was backed by evidence already in the hands of investigators. The reaction was immediate. This time, the Ashfords didn't release a statement right away. They waited, which told us something important. They were trying to assess damage before responding. And when they finally did, the tone had changed. It was no longer confident, it was defensive, carefully distancing certain individuals from specific decisions, subtly suggesting that internal processes may have been compromised. It was the beginning of separation, of blame redistribution, exactly what they had tried to do to me, only now it was happening inside their own structure. And once that starts, it rarely stops. The first resignation came 3 days later. Not Julian, not Eleanor, someone lower, someone easier to let go. It was framed as accountability, as a necessary step, but it didn't slow things down. If anything, it made things worse, because it confirmed what people were starting to suspect, that there was something real behind the headlines. And once confirmation exists, speculation expands. More names surfaced, more questions were asked, and the investigation deepened. Through all of it, Julian stayed silent. No messages, no attempts to contact me, which was different. Before, he had always tried to manage perception. Now he was waiting, and that told me he was either being advised to stay quiet, or he had realized that anything he said could make things worse. It didn't matter which, the effect was the same. Control was slipping. One evening, about a month after everything began, I received another message, this time from him. It was longer than the last one he had sent, less precise, less controlled. He said things had gone too far, that what was happening wasn't what he had intended, that there were pressures I didn't understand, that if I had just trusted him, things could have been handled differently. I read it twice, not because I was unsure how I felt, but because I wanted to be certain I wasn't missing anything. I wasn't. It was the same pattern, reframed, softer, but fundamentally unchanged. Responsibility redirected, reality adjusted. I didn't respond, because by then, I understood something clearly. Closure doesn't come from conversations like that. It comes from recognizing when someone is still trying to rewrite a story you already lived through. By the time the investigation reached its peak, the Ashford name no longer carried the same weight it once had. It still existed, still appeared in headlines, but the tone had shifted. What had once been associated with admiration was now tied to scrutiny, and reputation once cracked doesn't repair easily. I didn't attend any of the hearings. I didn't need to. Rowan kept me informed. Tessa continued reporting. And for the first time since all of this began, my life wasn't centered around reacting to them. It was moving forward on its own, quietly, steadily. There was no dramatic final moment, no single event where everything ended at once, just a series of outcomes, Charges filed, assets frozen, agreements dissolved, structures dismantled, and people, one by one, separating themselves from what they had once been part of. The last thing I heard about Julian was that he had relocated, not far, but far enough to avoid most of the attention, starting over in his own way. I don't know if he sees it as an ending or just another transition, and honestly, it doesn't matter, because the story stopped being about him a long time ago. It stopped being about the Ashfords, too. What stayed with me wasn't the exposure or even the fallout. It was the moment everything shifted. That hallway, that conversation, that instant where illusion gave way to clarity. And if there's one thing I understand now that I didn't then, it's this. The most dangerous situations aren't the ones that look unstable. They're the ones that look perfect, because perfection is where people hide the most. And sometimes the only reason you survive it is because you hear something you were never meant to hear.